Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is the place where we take complex source material, filter out the noise, and bring you the surprising nuggets of knowledge that genuinely make you well-informed.
Today, we are taking a time machine back about 2 millennia.
Right into the heart of the tumultuous world of early Jewish legal thought.
And we're starting with a premise that, honestly, it sounds almost unbelievable when you first hear it.
Go on.
Picture this. Some of the foundational rules, the very operating system used by ancient rabbis to interpret the holiest text in Judaism, the Torah, might have been directly inspired by, or at least structurally informed by, Greek thinkers like Aristotle.
And Roman legal heavyweights like Cicero.
Exactly. It's a wild idea.
It's the ultimate intellectual crossover episode, a perfect synthesis of Athens and Jerusalem. And this discovery isn't just a historical curiosity, it actually reveals the profound legal and, frankly, political fight that was raging in Judea at the time.
It really does. Our core subject is the hermeneutical methods the rabbis use, which are known as middot. That's the plural, pronounced midot.
Okay, midot.
And in the singular, it's middah, pronounced mida. These are the characteristic styles or rules they use to derive laws from the written text.
So they were basically turning the Torah into a living, breathing legal code that could adapt to new situations.
Yeah, was the goal.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is, I guess, threefold. First, we are going to trace the powerful structural parallels between these midrashic rules and classical rhetorical techniques, specifically the Greek topoi.
Second, we'll get into the crucial historical context. Why did they need these tools? It was all about providing the legal ammunition for the Pharisees to win their protracted sectarian disputes against the Sadducees.
And in doing so, establish the legitimacy and authority of the oral law, which was their whole project.
Precisely.
And then, and this is where it gets really interesting, we have to look at the complicated and ultimately skeptical relationship the rabbis developed toward the very tools of human logic they had embraced.
Yes. Because once you let the genie of reason out of the bottle, how do you stop it from, unraveling your entire tradition?
That's the question.
That tension between the need for a sophisticated, systematic logic to defend their tradition and the deep fear of that logic's inherent subjectivity, that's the core paradox we're diving into today, all drawn from a deep study of the affinity between midrashic hermeneutics and classical rhetoric.
All right, let's start at the beginning, the foundational list. Our sources point to Hillel the Elder's set of 7 rules. This is Hillel, who lived around the transition from the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE.
A pivotal time.
And he reportedly expounded these rules before the elders of Batera, and their purpose was, well, it was simple but revolutionary.
It was. He was trying to establish that the Torah's language follows certain conventions, which, if you know them, allow you to properly interpret and even derive new laws.
And just the act of creating a list of naming and systematizing these modes of interpretation is something scholars like David Daub and Saul Lieberman say is distinctly Greek.
Oh, absolutely. It reflects the systematic approach you'd find in a Hellenistic philosophical school. Before Hillel, interpretation was likely much more ad hoc. He turned it into an organized discipline.
So what was actually on this groundbreaking list? Let's lay out Hillel's 7 methods.
Okay, so first up, we have the argument a minori ad meus. It's the argument from a lesser to a greater case. The rabbinic term for this is qual vahomer.
Qual vahomer, literally lightness and heaviness.
Exactly. This is probably the most famous and most frequently used of all the rules.
What's number 2?
Second is the gezerah shava, which is the comparison of equals.
Okay, so you have lesser to greater, and then you have equals. What's next?
The third and fourth are sort of a pair. They're 2 related methods for establishing an overarching principle or an archetype known as a binyan av. You can derive this principle either from a single passage in the text or from the common denominator you find in 2 different passages.
I see. So you find a specific rule and you make it a general one.
That's the idea. Fifth is a rule about scope, a general category followed by a specific instance. The Hebrew for that is kela yufrat.
Okay.
And finally, number 6 and 7 are a bit more general. Something similar in another place and something derived from its immediate context.
When you look at that list, it's really those first 2 rules, the qual vahomer and the gezerah shava, where you see the intellectual synergy with the classical world just jumping off the page.
It's undeniable. It connects directly to the Greek concept of comparison or synkresis.
An analogical comparison was. I mean, that was the bedrock of persuasion in the classical world, wasn't it?
Completely. If you go back to Aristotle's rhetoric, he dedicates so much attention to this idea of tupoi.
Which translates roughly as places or lines of argument.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They were basically general conceptual patterns for constructing a persuasive proof, a toolkit for arguing.
So how did Aristotle's topoi connect to Hillel's first rule, the quo Homer?
Well, Aristotle included arguments from the more and the less. His classic rhetorical device was to establish a point where the conclusion should be even more obvious.
Right.
For example, he says, if not even the gods know everything, human beings can hardly do so.
Ah, I see. If it's true for the greater category, the gods, it is a fortiori, or all the more so true for the lesser category, humans.
Exactly. And the reverse is also true.
And he had a separate topic for the second rule, gezerah shava, the comparison of equivalents.
He did. He called it from analogy or precedent. The example he gives is, if Theseus did no wrong in abducting Helen, then Alexander did no wrong either. You establish an equivalence between two situations, and then you transfer the legal or moral judgment from one to the other.
So you've got the more and less argument and the analogy of equivalence. And then Cicero, the great Roman orator, he comes along and refines this into a really powerful tool for legal rhetoric.
Yes, and Cicero formalizing this is crucial because Roman law was the dominant legal culture surrounding Judea at that time. It was in the air.
So what did his schema look like?
Cicero laid it out very clearly. What holds in a wider sphere should hold in a more restricted one. The Latin for that is quod in re maior valet velat in menor.
That's a direct legal expression of quo Homer.
A perfect one. And he also, of course, included arguments from strict equivalence. What holds in the equivalent sphere should hold as well in this case.
How did Cicero actually use this in a real-world legal case? What kind of law was he trying to interpret?
The classic illustration involves the law of jus capiens.
Which is what exactly?
It's the law concerning how you acquire property through long use, or what we might call adverse possession today. The original written law said that if you use a piece of land without being challenged, the use and warranty for that land ran for 2 years. But for all other things, the period was only 1 year.
Okay, so here comes the ambiguity. What about a house? Is a house land, or is it all other things?
Exactly the problem. A house is clearly not land in a literal sense. But Cicero argued that since a house is conceptually and functionally equivalent to land, it's immovable property, it's permanently affixed, it should be subject to the same 2-year rule.
So he's using the known rule about land to persuade the court about the unknown rule for a house.
He's making a powerful practical demonstration of analogical reasoning to create equity in the law.
It's just fascinating how universal that legal need was. It shows that the problem Hillel was trying to solve, filling the gaps in these ancient, sometimes contradictory texts, was the exact same problem Roman jurists were wrestling with.
And that convergence gets even more formalized later on. A writer named Aelius Theon, who was writing rhetoric textbooks, what they called progymnasmata, he actually combined all 3 forms of comparison, greater, lesser, and equal, under the single Greek title of synkresis.
And he had a legal example for this, too.
A perfect one. It sounds like it could have been pulled straight out of the Talmud. He wrote, if the thief is punished for taking men's money, how much the more will this man be punished for looting the possessions of the gods?
Wow. A perfect quo Homer, from lesser sanctity to greater sanctity. So the structure of the argument is clearly shared. But you mentioned earlier that even the terminology suggests a connection.
This is where scholars like Lieberman move from just structural affinity to potential linguistic borrowing. He argued that the kind of strange Hebrew term gezerah shava comparison of equals likely gets its etymology from the Greek synkresis.
But hold on, doesn't gezerah usually mean decree or law in Hebrew, not comparison?
It does, but here's the kicker. Synkresis in Greek actually meant both comparison and decision or judgment. So Lieberman's theory was that when Jewish scholars encountered this Greek term, they translated the decision aspect of it, gezerah, decree, law, and then they applied this new term to the method of comparison itself because the Greeks were using the same word for both the process and the outcome.
That would be huge. It would mean Hillel wasn't just adopting Greek methods, but maybe even adopting Greek labels for those methods.
Which would cement the fact that he was participating in this much broader pan-Hellenistic intellectual movement.
It's a strong theory.
It is. A contested one, but strong. But the overwhelming consensus remains. Hillel's systematic list, and especially the content of his first two rules, the Qual Vahomer and the Izirashava, they perfectly map onto the primary analogy tools of the classical Ripods. They basically imported the operating system of classical persuasion to decode their own ancient text.
Okay, let's deepen the dive into how these rules actually function, because misunderstanding something like Qual Vahomer can really obscure its revolutionary nature. Early scholars, for instance, they often tried to equate it with the Aristotelian categorical syllogism.
Right. And understanding why they were fundamentally different it's the crucial intellectual distinction here.
So let's talk about the difference between rhetoric and logic.
This is really the difference between strict deductive logic and persuasive rhetoric. When Aristotle defined the categorical syllogism, he was focused on deduction. You relate a genus and a species, and the conclusion is necessarily 100% contained within the premises.
Give us the classic simple example of that deductive process.
The classic, of course. Major premise, all mortal things die. Minor premise, Socrates is a mortal thing, a species of the genus mortal things.
Conclusion, Socrates will die.
It's a closed hierarchical system. The premise absolutely guarantees the conclusion. There's no way around it.
And the Qual Vahomer does not offer that kind of guarantee.
Not at all. A Qual Vahomer is fundamentally a rhetorical analogy. It's an a fortiori argument. It compares two different categories that just happen to share an essential underlying quality.
The tertium comparationis.
The tertium comparationis, exactly. The third part of the comparison. So it argues from probability and persuasion, not from strict deduction within a single hierarchy.
Let's see this in action. Let's use that famous rabbinic legal example from Mishnah 12.5. This is the passage that addresses the prohibition against sending away the mother bird before you take her young.
Okay, so the law of the mother bird is designated a light commandment because if you violate it, there's no formal physical penalty. And the Torah promises that if you observe it, you'll have a long life.
Okay.
The Qual Vahomer argument then runs like this. If this light commandment promises long life, then all the more so Qual Vahomer will, the weighty, strict commandments of the Torah, the ones involving capital punishment or excision.
Also promise long life.
Right. They will also promise long life.
The conclusion seems perfectly logical, but where does it fail to meet that strict syllogistic standard?
The crucial point is that the weighty commandments are not a species of the light commandment. They are two completely different legal categories with different rules, different penalties.
I see.
You're only comparing them based on a shared value, the idea that God rewards them. Since the categories are distinct, the argument is purely analogical. It's rhetorical. It's designed to persuade you that the principle of reward is universal, not to deductively prove it.
And this immediately links back to those Roman legal arguments, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Think again about Quintilian's example. If it is lawful to kill a thief in the night, how much more is it lawful to kill an armed robber?
A thief and a robber are separate threats, but the logic of self-defense applies a fortiori to the greater threat.
You're persuading the judge through analogy. You're asking them to apply a legal principle to an unwritten case.
And the rabbis were so confident in this method, they even used it to handle the inverse situation.
They did. The Makilta has this really sophisticated example about theft. It says, if killing a thief who does not threaten violence makes a killer liable, which is based on a reading of Exodus 22,
Right.
then the killer of someone about whom there is doubt whether they even came to steal is liable all the more so.
The reasoning holds up, even when you flip it. It shows how versatile the tool was for legal development.
It does.
This is a huge realization for the listener. Hillel introduced not just a set of rules, but an entirely different philosophical mode of reasoning rhetoric right into the heart of Jewish legal interpretation.
That's the revolution.
Let's shift now to the third and fourth rules, the binyan av, the archetype rule. This idea of deriving a principle from one or two passages, it seems essential for building any kind of comprehensive legal system.
It is. Binyan av translates literally to father principle or archetype. It's the process of taking a very specific detail from one passage and elevating it into a general overarching legal principle.
Which you can then apply broadly to fill in the gaps in the law, especially where later passages are just silent on a matter.
Exactly.
So how does the Midrash give an example of deriving a general principle from just one passage?
The primary example comes from the ritual of the scapegoat, which is discussed in Leviticus 16. Verse 21 explicitly requires Aaron, when he's confessing the sins of the people, to lay both of his hands upon the scapegoat's head.
Both hands, a very specific detail.
Very specific, and the Midrash establishes the specific instruction as an archetype of binyan. The principle derived is that all laying of hands on any sacrifice must use both hands, even if a later verse describing a different sacrifice just uses the singular word hand.
Wow. So a single explicit detail becomes a universal rule for all sacrifices. That seems like an enormously ambitious leap of interpretation.
It is.
Was Roman law facing the exact same dilemma? I mean, how do you legislate when the text just goes silent?
They absolutely were. And the sources highlight this remarkable parallel in the interpretation of the Lex Aquila, which was a key piece of Roman law about property damage.
So the Roman legal problem was the same as the rabbinic one, interpreting silence in the law. How did the jurists handle that ambiguity?
Okay, so the context here is the law of liability for damaging someone's property. The first chapter of the Lex Aquila specifically dealt with the lethal killing of cattle or slaves. And it said that the offender had to pay the highest value the animal or person had attained in the previous year.
Okay, that makes sense. It prevents you from claiming the highest value if the animal was, say, sickly right before its death.
Right. Highest value in the previous year for lethal damage. Now you compare that to the third chapter of the law. This chapter dealt with non-lethal damage like burning, breaking, or bruising.
And the text.
The text describing the compensation for this non-lethal damage completely omitted the requirement to pay based on the highest value.
So if I burn my neighbor's fence, do I pay its value now or its highest value in the last year? The text is silent.
That is the interpretive gap, and the Roman jurist Sabinus argued that the highest value rule should be inserted into the third chapter even though it wasn't written there.
And his reasoning was?
He concluded that the rule was so fundamental that the legislator must have intended it to apply universally to all damage. They just thought it was sufficient to state the principle once in the first chapter. Sabinus was deriving a general archetype, a binyan av, from a single explicit instance.
Wait a minute. That is almost structurally identical to the rabbinic process.
It is stunning. And the Makilta, the early rabbinic legal midrash, addresses almost the exact same problem with agricultural damage. Exodus 22, verse 4, deals with compensation for grazing damage, and it explicitly requires compensation to be made with the best land or produce.
But
The best land requirement is then omitted in the very next verse, which deals with fire damage.
so the ambiguity is built right into the text side by side.
And the Makilta uses the first verse to establish a binyan av. It creates an overarching principle. Anyone who pays a fine must assess it only from the best available resources. It took a single explicit instance in the law of grazing and elevated it to a universal legal principle for all property damage.
This shared approach, this need to find an archetype in the text to fill legislative gaps, it so strongly reinforces the idea that the rabbis were not operating in a vacuum.
Not at all. They were participating in a shared Mediterranean intellectual tradition of legal distillation, of categorization, and analogical application. They were, in a way, proving their system was just as sophisticated as Rome's.
Which brings us to Section 3 and the critical question, why? Why go to all this trouble? Why adopt the legal operating system of the Gentiles? It was purely a matter of political and religious survival, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The late Second Temple period was defined by an intense crisis of authority. The legal landscape was just dominated by a sectarian strife, primarily between the Pharisees, who upheld this massive body of oral tradition, and the Sadducees, who rejected anything not explicitly written in the 5 books of Moses.
So the Sadducees were demanding a strictly literal biblical basis for every single law, and they fiercely attacked the Pharisees' reliance on these unwritten traditions.
It was an existential challenge. If the Pharisees couldn't prove that their oral traditions were implicitly contained within or logically derived from the written Torah, their whole legal system would collapse.
The traditions would just be dismissed as
Oh.
human invention.
Exactly.
Hillel, therefore, he becomes this incredibly strategic figure here. He's sometimes associated with Stoic philosophy, which, ironically, was the only major Hellenistic school that enthusiastically supported rhetoric as an art, as a tool for seeking truth.
So he essentially took the Sadducean challenge head on.
It seems like it. He took the existing, sometimes chaotic Pharisaic traditions and he systematized them using these rhetorical rules, the middot. The goal was to ground the oral law within Scripture.
Imbuing it with the same authoritative weight as the written text itself, this was a political maneuver for religious authority. He was showing their tradition wasn't arbitrary, but was rooted in divine communication.
The foundational story used to demonstrate this strategy is the Passover paradigm. The 14th day of Nisan falls on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And the leaders of the time, the elders of Betera, they were completely unsure. Does the communal Passover sacrifice supersede the laws of the Sabbath?
A huge question. And they turn to Hillel. And his response is a masterclass in deploying systematic, rhetorical reasoning to validate a tradition. The structure of his argument, as it's recorded in the Tosefta, is absolutely critical. He offers 3 systematic, logical proofs before he ever cites his source.
Okay, what was his first line of reasoning?
Proof 1 was an analogy, a hekwesh or gezerah shava. He compared the Passover sacrifice to the regular daily sacrifice, the tamid.
Okay.
Both are communal obligations, and the tamid is known to supersede the Sabbath. So, by comparison, so must the Passover sacrifice.
And the second proof?
Proof 2 was an analogy based on timing. Both the tamid and the Passover sacrifice are mandated by the Torah to be offered at its appointed time. Since the tamid's appointed time supersedes the Sabbath, the Passovers must as well.
And then the third, the rhetorical heavy hitter, the qual v'homer.
This is the definitive a fortiori argument, Hillel argued. If the tamid, the regular sacrifice, for which omission carries no major penalty, if that supersedes the Sabbath, is it not logical that the Passover sacrifice, for which failure to observe carries the severe penalty of karet, or excision from the community, must all the more so supersede the Sabbath?
It's the argument from the less important to the more important based on the severity of the penalty.
Precisely.
I have to stop you there. Just picture the elders of Betera. They are the established authorities, and this Babylonian upstart, Hillel, just dismantled their whole complex problem in 3 systematic, powerful, logical steps.
Using rules they could trace back to the Torah itself, it must have been utterly dazzling.
It must have been.
Dazzling and convincing. But here's the critical detail in that Tosefta version of the story. Hillel, only after presenting all 3 of his systematic rhetorical proofs does he say, in addition, I have received a tradition from my masters, Shemaiah and Naphtalion, that the Passover supersedes the Sabbath.
The sequencing is pure strategy. He didn't lead with tradition. He demonstrated first that systematic, midrashic exegesis was a reliable, powerful method that could, on its own, arrive at the exact same conclusion as the traditional law.
He validated the method by validating the tradition. It was brilliant.
And the sources show he used these methods for more than just that. He used them to resolve profound scriptural contradictions, which were often the source of the deepest sectarian fights. The Yerushalmi tells a story where Hillel came up from Babylonia and resolved 3 major issues.
Yes.
Let's focus on the third case, the one involving the timing of the barley offering, because this was a central point of contention with the Sadducees. It challenged the very heart of the Pharisaic calendar.
It was a huge fight. The Sadducees were locked into this very literal interpretation of Leviticus 23.1. They argued that the barley offering had to be held on the Sunday after Passover, because the verse uses the phrase on the morrow after the Sabbath.
And they took Sabbath literally to mean the weekly Saturday Sabbath.
Right. But the Pharisees needed the offering to happen earlier on the second day of Passover itself, to keep their calendar and their interpretation of counting the Omer consistent.
So the Sadducean challenge was powerful because it rested on a very literal reading of the text.
Extremely powerful. And it put the Pharisees in a tough spot, because the text itself presented a clear contradiction Hillel needed to solve to validate the Pharisaic custom.
Right. Deuteronomy 16.8 implies you eat unleavened bread for 6 days, but Exodus 12.15 requires eating it for 7 days. How did Hillel's midrashic method solve this?
He used this incredibly ingenious interpretation to distinguish the circumstances. He reasoned that the 6-day rule in Deuteronomy must refer to eating unleavened bread made from new grain, which could only be eaten after the barley offering was waived.
Okay.
But the 7-day rule in Exodus must refer to unleavened bread made from old grain, which was permitted the entire time.
So he didn't contradict either verse. He just showed they were speaking about different types of grain based on different legal moments in the calendar.
It was a brilliant, systematic interpretation that provided the scriptural grounding to confirm the Pharisaic position, that the barley offering must be held on the second day of Passover.
Which directly undermined the Sadducees' literal interpretation and validated the entire Pharisee movement's authority to interpret the text beyond just its surface level.
Exactly. So these methods weren't just defensive tools for upholding tradition, they were revolutionary tools for developing the law. They allowed the rabbis to adapt the halakha to new realities, like the destruction of the temple, all while maintaining the claim that the law was eternally rooted in the Torah.
they successfully weaponized rhetoric to save tradition.
In a sense, yes.
So the system worked. The methods were adopted, the Sadducees waned, and the Pharisees and their successors, the rabbis, they won the day.
Mm.
But the very power and flexibility of the rhetorical rules they embraced quickly became, well, a threat.
A threat to the stability of the law. This leads us to the skeptical turn.
The great paradox of reason.
It is. If reasoned exegesis is authoritative, it can just as easily disprove a traditional law as it can prove one. The moment human intellect becomes the ultimate arbiter, any tradition is vulnerable to a better, smarter, or just more persuasive analogy. The rabbis became terrified of unbridled reason.
And you can see this fear reflected in the later versions of the Hillel story. The Yerushalmi version of the story of Hillel and the elders of Betera is much later. It's far more embellished, and it explicitly introduces this tension, this profound skepticism about the reliability of human logic.
Right. In the Yerushalmi version, Hillel presents his three proofs: the analogy, the Qual Vahomer, and the Gezerah Shava. But unlike the Tosefta, the elders don't just accept them.
They systematically refute his logic.
Using rhetorical arrangement, ironically, they mirror the sophisticated Greek debate style Hillel himself was employing.
How did they dismantle his initial analogy, the Hekwesh, to the daily sacrifice?
They pointed out a critical flaw in the comparison. The regular daily sacrifice, the Tamid, has a limit on its frequency, only 2 per day. But the Passover sacrifice, they argued, has no such limit. It depends on the number of people in the group.
So since the scope of the obligation is fundamentally different, the analogy is invalid.
The comparison is shaky. And then they targeted his most powerful tool, the Qual Vahomer, the argument from severity.
Okay.
Hillel argued that since the Passover carries the severe penalty of excision, it must supersede the Sabbath a fortiori over the Tamid, which doesn't. But the elders' rebuttal was that the Tamid is of the most holy class of sacrifice, while the Passover is of the lesser holy class.
So they're saying the intrinsic sanctity of the source object, the Tamid, is greater than the target object, the Passover.
Yeah.
So the argument from lesser to greater collapses.
Exactly. The sanctity of the sacrifice, not the penalty for its omission, should be the pivot point.
That is a technically brilliant counterargument. It shows that Qual Vahomer relies entirely on choosing the correct pivot, the tertium comparosianus. And if you choose a different pivot, the conclusion can completely reverse.
Precisely. And here's the punchline in the Yerushalmi version. They tell Hillel they only accept the ruling of the Gezerah Shava only because he received it as a tradition from his masters, Shemaiah and Eftalion.
The moral is just crystal clear. Even after Hillel employed the full suite of systematic logical tools available in the Greco-Roman world, the elders would not accept the ruling until he cited the explicit received tradition.
The story uses rhetorical refinement to ironically demonstrate the fundamental unreliability of human reason when applied to divine law.
This deep skepticism was rooted in the rabbinic recognition that the flexibility of Qual Vahomer, its great strength against the Sadducees, was also its greatest weakness.
It could be used in mutually opposing directions, and that could lead to dangerously sophistic conclusions.
The danger of this flexibility is famously demonstrated in the story of Arios ben Tadai, who tried to use Qual Vahomer to logically prove a result that directly contradicted the written Torah.
This is a spectacular example of logic just gone completely rogue. Arios ben Tadai approached Rabban Gamaliel and posed an argument about prohibited marriages. He said, "If my wife, to whom I am permitted, which is the lesser prohibition, I am prohibited from her daughter, my stepdaughter, then a married woman to whom I am prohibited, the greater prohibition, all the more so should I not be prohibited to her daughter."
Wait, if that argument holds, then every married woman's daughter, regardless of who her father is, would be prohibited to every man, which would lead to the logical conclusion that virtually all marriages are prohibited. It's logically flawless within its own frame, but functionally absurd.
It is logically sound based on his chosen pivot point, but because it generated a conclusion that overturned a fundamental, explicit law of the Torah, Rabban Gamaliel's response was immediate. "We do not use reason to uproot a matter from the Torah," and he excommunicated him.
The law is inviolable. Therefore, the method that contradicted it must be flawed.
Exactly. This highlights that the ultimate legal system of the rabbis wasn't based on reason. Reason was merely a tool that could only operate within a divinely revealed framework.
And this volatility is why the Sadducees were such avid practitioners of the Qual Vahomer. They used it precisely because it was logical and it appealed to this objective legal realism that seemed to transcend tradition.
Right. And nearly half of the explicit Pharisee-Sadducee controversies hinge on this specific rhetorical tool.
Give us another example of the Sadducean weaponization of the Quava Homer.
Okay, take the famous polemic about liability for damage, which is documented in the Mishnah. The Sadducees presented this powerful qualva homer. The Torah holds an owner liable for damage caused by an ox, a beast of burden, for whom the owner is not responsible for observing the commandments.
Right.
So they argued. If the owner is liable for the ox, the lesser case, they should all the more so be liable for damage caused by a slave, the greater case, for whom the owner is responsible for ensuring the observance of commandments.
That is a brilliant argument. It transfers the principle of liability from the realm of property to the realm of human supervision, using an a fortiori claim.
It seems compelling, but the Pharisees had to rebut it by identifying the break in the analogy. They successfully countered that slaves possess intelligence and free will. Holding an owner liable for a slave's actions could lead to the absurdity of the slave causing intentional damage just to make the owner financially liable. They severed the analogy by pointing out that the tertium comparationis was false. An ox does not have intentionality, but a slave does.
That is high-stakes legal combat, and it leads to a fascinating subtle insight. Some scholars suggest that by placing these subversive, yet technically logical arguments in the mouths of the Sadducees, the rabbis were sending a clear message to any internal dissidents.
The message being, if you deploy this kind of argument against the established rabbinic consensus, you risk being labeled a Sadducee heretic.
So since the Qualva Homer was too useful and too ubiquitous to be banned entirely, it appears over 1,000 times in rabbinic literature, the rabbis didn't eliminate it. They implemented strict, formalized boundaries to contain its volatility.
Exactly, they put up guardrails.
And the first and most famous rule put in place to govern this logic is the principle of dio.
Dio. It means simply, it is enough. The rule states that the deduced law, the conclusion of the Qualva Homer, may not be more stringent than the source of the derivation. It limits the analogical ambition of the interpreter.
What's so profound is that the sources show the rabbis claim this limitation wasn't established by human ingenuity. It was established by God's own intervention in the Torah itself.
Through the story of Miriam, and this is the dramatic foundation of the rule from Numbers chapter 12. Moses' sister, Miriam, is afflicted with leprosy after slandering Moses. And God uses a Qualva Homer to determine her required period of quarantine. God states, if her father spat in her face, would she not bear her shame for 7 days? Let her be shut out of camp for 7 days.
The pure human logic would dictate a much harsher penalty, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. The expected logical deduction would be, if her father, who is just flesh and blood, shaming her requires 7 days of punishment, then God, the creator, shaming her should logically require 14 days. But God intervened and declared, dio.
It is enough, limiting the punishment to 7 days.
And the implication of God establishing the dio rule is profound. It demonstrates that even when the logic is sound and the analogy is compelling, as the logic for 14 days certainly was, human reason when dealing with divine law must be constrained by explicit authority.
So the authority of the Qualva Homer and the authority of its limitation doesn't come from human intellect. It comes from its explicit use and constraint in the Torah itself. It's the ultimate check on analogical ambition.
You can use logic to expand a rule, but you can't use it to enhance a penalty beyond the original source law.
Okay, so what was the second limitation?
The second concerned consistency between source types. The rabbis established a clear hierarchy of legal authority. The Mishnah in Yadam teaches that one may not derive matters of Torah from matters of the scribes, nor matters of the scribes from the words of the Torah.
Why that restriction? Why can't the laws of the scribes act as a reliable source for an analogy?
Because the scribes legislated decrees rabbinic enactments according to the immediate needs of the times. Their enactments might not be consistently more stringent in weighty matters, they might just be pragmatic safety fences.
So the underlying reason for a scribal law is contextual and pragmatic, which makes it an unreliable, potentially misleading source for comparison with the eternal principles in the Torah itself.
Exactly. The midot only work when applied to the Torah based on received tradition.
And the third limitation deals with the finality of the law. In Onshin Min Haden, a court cannot impose physical punishment on the basis of a Qualva Homer alone.
This is the ultimate safety valve. It confirms the rhetorical nature of the tool. The logic here is that the Torah itself shows us that explicit warrant is needed.
Where do we see that?
In Leviticus, regarding the liability for marrying one's sister, you could logically derive the liability for marrying a full sister from the liability for marrying a half-sister using Qualva Homer. But the verse adds the word his sister explicitly, even though it seems redundant.
The seemingly redundant word proves the point that explicit scriptural warrant is needed for punishment. Logic is not enough.
It's the formal acknowledgement of the tool's inherent flaw. As Samuel Hanagid explained centuries later, reasoning is uncertain, and sometimes one is mistaken in his reasoning, even though we do not realize it. Punishment requires certainty, which can only come from explicit scriptural warrant, not from a convincing analogy.
So while these three limitations successfully contained the volatile quava homer, the rabbis needed an entirely different set of rules to tame the second great analogical tool,
Gezerah Shava.
the comparison of equals. Yes. And the initial Greek and early rabbinic use of Gezerah Shava was based on conceptual analogies like Cicero comparing houses and land. But because those proved too subjective, the rabbis shifted the weight of the argument dramatically.
They moved away from conceptual affinity to a purely verbal analogy, comparing two passages only because they shared a common word or phrase.
Why did they feel compelled to move away from conceptual arguments? I mean, they seem more robust philosophically.
Because they proved too ambiguous. You can see this brilliantly in the debate over the law of debt remission during the sabbatical year. The law of debt remission, the sabbatical for land, and the law of the Hebrew slave all revolved around a 7-year cycle.
So how did conceptual analogies fail here?
The key question was, is the forgiveness of debts, collective meaning all debts are canceled at the end of the sabbatical year, regardless of when they were taken out? Or is it counted individually for each loan, like a slave's term of service?
If you look conceptually, you can make a good argument for both sides.
Exactly. Conceptual analogy 1. Debt remission is like the land sabbatical because both are universal laws independent of the Jubilee. That argues for a collective cancellation. Conceptual analogy 2. Debt remission is like the Hebrew slave because both apply inside and outside the land of Israel. That argues for an individual 7-year count.
Since compelling reason could justify either outcome, the Midrash was forced to discard human conceptual logic entirely.
And resort to the verbal parallel. Only the two passages that share the exact same phrase, 7 years, could be compared.
The philosophical shift there is profound. The law has to be validated by the Torah's own language, ensuring the analogy isn't based on human subjectivity, but on objective patterns the text itself provides.
The authority comes from the text, not the interpreter's conceptual framework.
And this required formalized rules for validating the verbal analogy, which led to the development of two major Tannaitic systems.
Correct. You have the system of Rabbi Akiva, who required that the shared phrase used for comparison must be unique. It has to occur only twice in the entire Pentateuch. If a phrase occurs only twice, the comparison is unavoidable. The text itself is telling you to link them.
And Rabbi Ishmael had an even stricter, more famous requirement centered on the idea of a word being extraneous.
Right. Rabbi Ishmael required at least one of the occurrences of the word to be extraneous, or mufne, meaning the verse was redundant in its own immediate context and therefore free to act as a reference point for an analogy somewhere else.
So Rabbi Ishmael is essentially saying the Torah has to put a little signpost on its own redundancy to tell the interpreter where they are allowed to draw an analogy.
That's the philosophical implication. By requiring mufna, Rabbi Ishmael shifts the agency of the analogy away from the reader's will and places it squarely in Scripture. The reader becomes submissive, waiting for Scripture itself to make the meaning clear by providing a redundant word that is free to signal an analogy.
It's the highest level of textual control.
It is.
And the final irony. As the rules for Gezerah Shava became looser in the later Amoraic period, threatening an infinite number of possible derivations again, the rabbis instituted the most severe limitation of all.
They effectively made the tool obsolete as an independent logical method. The final nail in the coffin was the decree. One may not infer a Gezerah Shava on his own.
It could only be repeated if it was received as an established tradition.
The moment the logical tool became too flexible and threatened to overwhelm the system, it was entirely subsumed under the authority of tradition, the very thing it was originally designed to protect. The expansion of its use led to its practical extinction as an independent tool of reason.
What a phenomenal trajectory. We started with Hillel, who introduced systematic Hellenistic rhetorical logic to fight his political and religious battles.
And we end with the necessary limitations placed on that very same logic to prevent it from destroying the law it was meant to defend.
It truly highlights the central, enduring paradox of legal thought. The rabbis successfully leveraged the most powerful intellectual tool of their day to secure their authority and stabilize the oral law.
but they simultaneously recognize the inherent danger, the contingency of human interpretation.
The final insight we take from this deep dive is that the rabbis did not repudiate rhetorical methods entirely. They
Right.
subsumed them. They insisted that reason unaided by scripture produces uncertain propositions.
Reason that is too clever will eventually prove an absurdity, like the case of Ario's Ben today.
But reason operating within the explicit limits of scripture, constrained by the Deo principle and the rules for modal analogy, that produces truth.
The authority of the law, in the end, derives not from the convincing power of human intellect, but from the Torah acting as a self-interpreting, divine text, guided by the explicit constraints the rabbis built into the system.
It's a profound model for navigating legal interpretation, one that recognizes human ingenuity while fearing its potential for chaos. And that brings us to our provocative thought for you, the listener. This tension between relying on persuasive human analogy to interpret existing rules and fearing its volatility is not just an ancient problem.
Not at all. Think about modern political and legal debate, especially in complex areas like constitutional law or international relations. Where today do you see analogous arguments being made? These arguments based on if this holds true in case A, it must hold true in case B.
Arguments that are powerful and convincing but might rely on fallacious assumptions or an analogy between two unequal categories, much like the seduction argument about the ox and the slave.
And perhaps more importantly, where in modern systems do we desperately need a Deo limitation today? A self-imposed rule, a philosophical speed bump that says it is enough.
Stopping the derived legal principle or regulatory consequence from expanding in severity beyond its original source, just because the logic is compelling. Where does human reason need to be explicitly told, stop, you've gone far enough?
We encourage you to explore the lasting and often underappreciated intellectual influence of Hellenism on early rabbinic thought, and to always question the logical consistency of the analogies presented to you, whether they are discussing an ancient legal text or a contemporary political crisis.
That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thank you for listening.